The perimeter alarm screamed at 2:47, and Cale Maddox was already on his feet before the second pulse hit. He had been sleeping in his boots. 3 weeks at Corvith Station, and he still could not break the habit, not with 12 species packed into a dormitory wing built for 6, not with the kind of tension that turned shared breathing into provocation. He grabbed the tactical harness off the hook beside his bunk and pulled it over his shoulders in one smooth motion, the muscle memory of 4 years at Fort Kessler doing the work his brain had not yet caught up to. His hands found the buckles in the dark, snapped them closed, checked the fit. 4 seconds. He had done it 10,000 times. The corridor was chaos. Cadets poured from their quarters in various states of readiness, some armored, some barefoot, a few still sealed inside their species-specific sleep chambers. The emergency strip lighting along the ceiling had switched from soft amber to sharp white, the kind of light that meant this was not a drill. Drills came with the 3-tone chime and the calm recorded voice of Station Commander Areth. This was the raw alarm. The one nobody at Corvith had heard outside of orientation week, when the proctor played it once and said, "If you ever hear this for real, you have already made several poor decisions." Cale moved against the current, heading for the tactical bay instead of the assembly corridor. He passed a cluster of Thessari cadets pressed flat against the wall, their narrow faces rigid, cranial ridges pulsing a muted blue that meant fear held very still. He passed 2 Gorathi cadets trying to force their armored carapaces through a doorway built for lighter species, one of them swearing in a subsonic register that Cale felt in his molars more than heard. He passed a Vresi cadet whose entire body had gone translucent with stress, the bioluminescent markers along its spine flickering too fast, broadcasting panic in a language every species on the station could read. Nobody was talking to each other. That was the problem. 3 weeks of joint integration training at Corvith, and 12 species still moved in their own currents, each one flowing past the others without touching. They had eaten meals in the same cafeteria at separate tables, the seating pattern as rigid as a territorial map, Thessari in the north corner, Gorathi along the east wall, Vresi clustered in the center where the lighting was dimmest, Kelthari wherever there was the most structural support beneath the floor. They had run drills on the same training floor without making eye contact. They had slept in adjacent bunks and treated the walls between them as if they were light years wide. Cale reached the tactical bay and slapped his palm against the entry pad. The door cycled open. Inside, the main display wall was already alive, a 3-dimensional holographic projection of Corvith Station and the surrounding sector, and the projection was wrong. There were shapes on the perimeter that should not have been there, 7 of them, closing at a speed that made Cale's stomach drop. Proctor Veshin was standing at the central console, her 4-armed frame rigid, her silver-blue skin reflecting the cyan glow of the display. She turned when Cale entered, and for one fraction of a second, he saw something in her expression that he had never seen in 3 weeks of training under her command. She was afraid. "Cadet Maddox," she said, and her voice was the same flat tone it always was, but the secondary vocal harmonics that Thessari used for emotional context were gone, stripped clean. She was controlling herself that hard. The station's defense complement shipped out 14 hours ago for the Vethran fleet exercises. We received no advance warning of this approach. The garrison is skeleton crew, 31 personnel, 11 of them are cadets. "What are they?" Cale asked, looking at the 7 shapes. Keth Voller raiding formation, 7 gunships. Standard complement per ship is 40 to 60 fighters. Cale did the math without wanting to. 300 to 400 Keth Voller against 31 defenders, 11 of whom were students who had never fired a weapon outside a simulator. The Keth Voller did not take prisoners. Every species in the compact knew that. They stripped stations for materiel and left the crews floating. "Why us?" he said. "Because the defense fleet is gone, and someone told them." Veshin's mandibles clicked once, a sound Kale had learned to read as controlled fury. This is not random, this is informed. They know the station is soft. Behind Kale, the tactical bay door opened again. He turned and saw them filing in, one by one, the cadets he had spent 3 weeks failing to build into anything resembling a unit. Not because they lacked talent. Every one of them was the top graduate of their species' own academy pipeline. They had been sent to Corvus specifically because they were the best, the ones their governments trusted to represent their species in a joint integration program designed to build cross-species military cooperation. The problem was not ability. The problem was that 12 species with 12 evolutionary histories, 12 combat doctrines, 12 sets of instincts, and 12 definitions of courage had been shoved into one dormitory wing and told to become a team in 4 weeks. And 3 of those weeks had been spent proving, in every drill and every exercise and every meal shared in hostile silence, that they could not. Thesari cadet Jorith Saul entered first, tall, storm-gray, her amber eyes scanning the display wall and processing the threat count in the time it took her to cross the threshold. Behind her came Gorathi cadet Dihun Vor, his oxidized copper carapace still bearing the scuff marks from yesterday's sparring exercise where he had refused to pair with the Vresi because their exoskeletons were too fragile. Then Vresi cadet Pale, barely a meter tall, translucent skin pulsing with agitated light, who had filed a formal complaint against Dihun Vor for the sparring refusal. Then Kelthari cadet Ashin, layered secondary eyelids half closed in the bright light, who had not spoken a voluntary word to any non-Kelthari cadet since arriving. Then the rest Morvathi cadet Thesic, whose sonic burst organs sat tucked beneath her jaw like coiled springs, Dren cadet Vasho, four-legged and steady as a piece of furniture, Sulak cadet Iniri, her forearms glistening with the pre-compound sheen her species produced under stress. 10 alien cadets, plus Kale. 11 students who could not agree on how to walk through a doorway. And outside, 7 gunships full of Kethvolar were 12 minutes from weapons range. Proctor Veshin looked at all of them. The silence in the tactical bay was absolute. "I will not lie to you," she said. "The garrison has 19 non-cadet personnel, 12 are technical staff, 4 are medical, 3 are security, and 1 of them is injured from a maintenance accident this morning. The defense grid is automated but limited. It will buy time, not victory. The fleet cannot return for 9 hours minimum. A distress signal has been sent, but no response has been confirmed." She paused, her forearms folded behind her back in the formal Thesari posture that meant a decision was being transferred. Station protocol places cadets under evacuation priority. There are 2 emergency pods on the lower ring. Each holds 6. You will evacuate. Nobody moved. Kale looked at the display. The 7 shapes were closer now. He could see the formation pattern, a staggered V, the lead ship slightly forward, the flanking ship's echelon to cover approach vectors. It was a standard Kethvolar hunting spread, and it was textbook, which meant their commander was experienced but not creative. That was something. An experienced but uncreative enemy would not improvise. They would follow their doctrine, and doctrine in a tight corridor was a leash. "Proctor," Kale said, "where do the pods go?" "Nearest compact relay is 4 hours at pod speed. And the Kethvolar can outrun a pod." Veshin said nothing, which was the answer. "So the pods are not an evacuation," Kale said. "They are a slower way to die." Again, silence. Several of the alien cadets shifted. Dihun Vor's mandibles ground together. Jorith's cranial ridges flickered a color Kale had not seen before, not fear, not anger. Something between. "Cadet Maddox," Veshin said carefully, "you are not authorized to." "I'm not authorizing anything." Kale turned to face the other cadets. 10 faces, some with faces, some with sensory clusters, some with compound eyes that held no readable expression at all. But they were all looking at him. For 3 weeks they had mostly avoided looking at him, the way they avoided looking at each other, the way 12 species avoided everything that was not their own reflection. But now they were looking. "Here is what I see," he said. 12 pods, 12 minutes, 4 hours to a relay that may or may not have heard our signal. Or 31 people defending a station with a choke point architecture that was built by engineers who knew exactly how to make a hallway into a kill zone. I'm not telling anyone what to do, but I am staying, and I have 4 years of close quarters defensive training from a species that has been fighting in hallways since before we had electricity. He let that sit. Jorith Saul was the first to speak. The Thessari do not evacuate while a garrison holds. Dhunvor's carapace plates shifted, a rolling click that ran from his shoulders to his thorax. Gorathi do not run from a fixed position. It is not in the architecture of our bodies. Pale the Vresi flickered the bioluminescent markers along her spine, stabilizing from panic strobing into something steadier, something deliberate. "Vresi eyes see in spectra your sensors cannot," she said. "I can spot a Keth Volar through 2 bulkheads by heat signature alone. If you need to know where they are before they know where you are, you need me." One by one they spoke, not grandly, not with speeches, just short, flat statements of what they could do and why they were not leaving. Thessic, the Morvathi, touched her jaw where the sonic organs coiled and said, "In an enclosed corridor I can make the air hurt." Vasho, the Dren, planted all 4 feet and said, "I do not fall down." "Use that." Iniri, the Sulek, held up her glistening forearms and said, "I can seal a hull breach in 9 seconds, or a doorway." Ashen, the Kelthari, said nothing for a long time. The others had finished and the silence had started to stretch uncomfortably before he spoke. "I will hold whatever section you put me in. That is enough." Proctor Veshin watched all of this with an expression that Kale could not fully read. Then she said, very quietly, "This is not authorized." "No," Kale agreed, "it is not." She looked at the display. The 7 shapes were 9 minutes out. "Then I will log it as a training exercise," she said. "A live fire integration drill, initiated by Proctor Veshin, authorized under subsection 14 of the emergency curriculum. If any of you survive, the paperwork will be very interesting." Kale almost smiled. He turned back to the display and pulled up the station schematic. Corvith was a standard compact research and training platform, a central hub with 6 radial arms, each arm containing dormitories, labs, training bays, and utility corridors. The arms connected to the hub through reinforced transit junctions, each junction a narrow corridor with blast doors at both ends. 6 arms, 6 choke points, and the Keth Volar would have to come through them. "They will breach the outer hull on at least 2 arms simultaneously," Kale said. "Standard Keth Volar doctrine, multiple entry points to split the defense. They do not know our numbers. They know the fleet is gone, so they are expecting light resistance, but they are cautious enough to use proper breach formation." He looked at the cadets. "We have 11 cadets and 3 functioning security officers, 14 fighters, against 3 to 400. We are not going to win a force-on-force engagement. We are going to make every corridor a nightmare. We are going to use what each of you does better than anyone else in this room, and we are going to make them pay for every meter." He started assigning positions, and this was where the 3 weeks of failed integration exercises, the ones that had produced nothing but resentment and formal complaints and hostile silences, suddenly became the only education that mattered, because Kale had watched. Through every failed drill, every refused pairing, every argument about doctrine that ended with someone walking out, he had watched. He knew what each of them could do, not because they had shown him willingly, but because ability leaks through even when cooperation does not. "Jorith, you and Ashen take Arm 3 Junction. Thessari reaction speed plus Kelthari endurance, you hold that corridor until I tell you otherwise or until you physically cannot. Jorith calls targets, Ashen anchors the position." Jorith looked at Ashen. Ashen looked at Jorith. They had not exchanged more than 10 words in 3 weeks. Joreth had once referred to the Kelthari as decorative boulders during a tactics seminar, and Ossian had overheard, and neither of them had acknowledged the incident, and it had sat between them like a stone in a shoe ever since. But Joreth gave a short nod now, and Ossian's secondary eyelids closed once the Kelthari equivalent of agreement. Dihunvor, you and Pale take arm 5. Gorathi armor in front, Vresi eyes behind. Dihunvor, you are the wall. Nothing gets past your carapace in a corridor that narrow. Pale, you are the warning system. You see them coming through the bulkhead before they clear the breach, and you call the distance. Dihunvor fires on your mark, not his. Dihunvor's mandibles opened, and for a moment Kale thought the Gorathi would refuse. He had refused to train with Pale 3 times in 3 weeks. The size difference alone was absurd. Dihunvor massed 4 times what Pale did, and his species' entire combat philosophy was built around individual armored dominance. Being told to fire on a Vresi's mark was, in Gorathi terms, being told to subordinate his warrior instinct to a creature he could accidentally step on. But Dihunvor looked at the display, and the 7 shapes were 8 minutes out, and something shifted behind those compound amber eyes. On her mark, he said. The words sounded like they cost him something. He said them anyway. Thesic and Vasho, arm 2. Thesic, your sonic burst is your primary weapon. In a corridor that size, 1 pulse will disorient everything within 15 meters. Vasho, you anchor, you do not move. When they stumble, you fire. When they push, you hold ground. Vasho stamped one of her 4 hooves against the deck. A Dren gesture Kale had learned meant not just agreement but eagerness. The sound echoed in the tactical bay like a judge's gavel. Iniri, you are mobile. You go where the hull breaks. If atmosphere vents, you seal it. If a doorway needs to become a wall, you make it one. You are the only person on this station who can close a hole faster than the enemy can open one. Iniri's forearms flexed, and a thin bead of silver-gray compound welled along her wrist seam. She wiped it absently against her thigh, a nervous habit Kale had noticed, the way humans crack their knuckles. I will need to eat, she said. The compound depletes my calcium reserves. If this goes long, I will need protein supplements from the medical bay. Noted, I will make sure medical knows. The remaining cadets, a 2nd Thesari, a 2nd Gorathi, and a Morvathi, were assigned to arms 4 and 6 with the security officers, doubling up at the junctions the way Kale would have doubled up a fire team in any corridor defense he had ever trained for. Proctor Veshin coordinated from the tactical bay, and Kale took arm 1, alone. You are assigning yourself a solo position, Veshin observed. Arm 1 is the most likely primary breach point, widest hull section, closest to the station's power core. They will send their heaviest element there. And you are 1 cadet. I am 1 human in a hallway, Kale said. That is what I am built for. He said it without bravado. It was a statement of engineering his species had been fighting in enclosed spaces since the cave mouth, since the trench, since the breach. Hallways were where humans lived. Every other species in the room had evolved for open terrain, for sky, for canopy, for ocean. Humans had evolved for the door. Veshin did not argue further. The 6 minutes before the breach were the longest of Kale's life. He used them. He walked the length of arm 1 twice, memorizing the distances between maintenance junctions, counting the angle changes, identifying the spots where the corridor kinked or narrowed or opened into a service alcove. He placed 2 portable barricade units, standard academy training equipment, not military grade, but enough to funnel movement in a corridor, this width at the angles that forced any attacking formation to compress from 4 abreast to 2. He set 2 more at the next junction, creating a second choke point. Then he walked back to his primary position, 30 meters from the outer blast door, behind a maintenance junction where the corridor kinked 45 degrees, and he waited. The first Keth Voller breach came at 3:01, exactly where he had predicted. He heard the hull cutting charges before he saw anything, a deep resonant thud that vibrated through the deck plating, followed by the shriek of atmosphere venting through the initial puncture before the station's auto seal engaged. Then the blast door at the far end of the corridor buckled inward, not breached but deformed, and through the gap came the first wave. Kethvoller were tall, angular, covered in interlocking dark gray chitinous plates that served as natural armor. Their eyes were vertical slits that glowed a faint amber in low light, and they moved with a jerking, insected efficiency that was fast but predictable once you understood the pattern. They fought in clusters of 4, each cluster operating as a single tactical unit, and they entered the corridor in exactly that formation 4 abreast, weapons up, the lead pair scanning, the rear pair covering. Cale waited until the first cluster cleared the barricade and entered the kink. They were compressing, the 4 abreast formation cramping to 2 because the barricade left no choice, and the rear pair was stacking behind the front pair. And for 3 seconds they were a single column of 4 bodies in a corridor barely wide enough for 2. Then he fired. The Academy-issue pulse rifle was not a war weapon. It was a training tool with 3 power settings, and even the highest setting was designed to incapacitate, not kill. But at 6 meters, in a corridor where the target had no room to maneuver, the difference between incapacitate and neutralize was academic. The first 2 Kethvoller went down hard. The second 2 tried to reverse, and the corridor was too narrow for a clean turn with 4 bodies already on the deck, and Cale fired twice more. The second cluster was smarter. They heard the fire and stopped short of the kink, and then they tried to push through with suppressive fire, rapid pulses hammering the corridor walls, chewing into the composite paneling, filling the air with ionized particulate that stung Cale's eyes and coated his tongue with the taste of burned polymer. He dropped back to the next position, then the next. Each position was another kink, another narrowing, another place where the corridor's architecture did his work. The engineers who had built Corvus had not designed it for defense, but any structure with regular angle changes and modular bulkheads was a defender's gift, and Cale used every meter of it. On Arm 2, Thesic fired her first sonic burst at 303. The sound was not something the other species could hear in the conventional sense. The Morvathi sonic organ operated at frequencies below the threshold of most alien auditory systems, but the effect was physical, not auditory. The air in the corridor compressed, bounced off the walls, and returned as a pressure wave that hit the Kethvoller entry team like an invisible fist. 3 of the 4 staggered sideways, their chitinous plates rattling against each other with a sound like dropped crockery. The 4th hit the wall and slid down it. Vasho fired from behind Thesic, without moving her 4 feet from their planted position. The Dren's entire body was built for stability, low center of gravity, wide stance, dense bone structure in the legs that made her functionally impossible to knock over. She fired with the same unhurried steadiness with which she did everything, and at 12 meters in a corridor where the targets were staggering and disoriented, every shot found its mark. On Arm 3, Jorith and Ascian were fighting. The Kethvoller breached their corridor at 3:04. Jorith's Thesari reflexes, reaction times that clocked at roughly 3 times human standard, made her devastating in a firefight where the engagement distance was under 20 meters. She did not aim in the way that most species aimed. She perceived the target's movement vector, calculated the intercept, and fired before the target reached the point she had already chosen. From the outside, it looked like she was shooting at empty space, and the enemy was walking into the shots. Ascian stood behind her and did not move. The Kelthari was built for endurance the way a mountain was built for weather, low center of gravity, dense musculature, layered bone structure that distributed impact across the entire skeletal frame. When suppressive fire came down the corridor and Jorith had to duck behind cover, Ascian stepped into the gap and absorbed it. His secondary eyelid sealed. His tertiary dermis, a subcutaneous layer of shock-absorbent tissue unique to Kelthari, engaged, and the pulse rounds that would have knocked any other cadet flat dissipated across his body like rain on stone. He stood there and took it, and Jorith had time to breathe, to reset, to pick her next 3 targets. 3 more left wall, 6 meters past the second junction, she called. "I see them," Ashton said. It was the longest sentence he had spoken to a non-Kelthari in 3 weeks. He did not seem to notice. Neither did she. On arm 5, the pairing that should not have worked was working. Pale crouched behind D. Hunvor's massive carapace, her translucent body pressed against the back of his armored thorax, her eyes, all 6 of them, cycling through spectral ranges that the station's sensors could not match. She could see the Keth Volar through the bulkhead. Not clearly, not in detail, but she could see the heat signatures, the movement patterns, the clustering that meant a push was coming. 4 stacked right side, they will breach in 3 seconds, she said, her voice a rapid, clicking cadence that D. Hunvor had never bothered to learn to parse before tonight. He was parsing it now. His brain was doing the work of translation, not because he wanted to, but because his survival depended on it, and Gorathi brains were nothing if not pragmatic about survival. Distance. 11 meters when they clear. D. Hunvor braced, his 4 arms locked into firing position, 2 holding the pulse rifle, 2 anchored against the corridor walls for stability. When the Keth Volar cleared the breach point, he was already firing, and at 11 meters with a Gorathi's natural targeting instinct, every shot landed. 4 down, Pale confirmed. Next group 20 seconds, 8 this time, they are doubling. Let them, D. Hunvor said, and the subharmonic register of his voice carried something that Pale had never heard from a Gorathi directed at a Vresi before. It was not warmth. It was not friendship. It was the sound a Gorathi made when he acknowledged that the creature behind him was keeping him alive. The fighting lasted 4 hours. It should not have lasted 4 minutes. The force ratio was absurd, roughly 30 to 1, with the defenders using training equipment against combat-grade weapons, holding a station that was never designed to be held. Every tactical doctrine in the Compact's military library said that a force this outnumbered, this outgunned, this undertrained should have been overrun in the first wave. The doctrines did not account for hallways. Kale fell back through arm 1 meter by meter, using every angle, every maintenance hatch, every ventilation junction. He took his first hit at 318, a grazing pulse burn across his left shoulder that cauterized as it cut, leaving a line of seared skin that smelled like cooked metal. He kept moving. At 332, a concussive impact caught his chest plate and cracked 2 ribs and sent him into the wall hard enough to blur his vision for 4 seconds. He breathed through it, shallow and controlled. The way the instructors at Kessler had taught pain is information, not a command. At 341, a pulse round clipped his right thigh, and he dropped to 1 knee and then got back up and kept firing from a lower angle, using the kink in the corridor as a shooting rest. The Keth Volar expected him to stop. They expected the pain and the fatigue and the isolation of a solo position to break him, because in their experience, solitary defenders broke. A single fighter without support, without resupply, without the psychological anchor of comrades in visual range, was supposed to crack. Their doctrine was built on it: isolate, pressure, overwhelm. They had not fought a human in a hallway before. Kale had heard a story once at Kessler about a sergeant from Earth's history who had held a bridge alone for 2 hours against a force of several hundred. The sergeant had been wounded 11 times. He held the bridge. Kale was not comparing himself to that sergeant. He was noting that the species that produced that sergeant had given him 4 years of training in exactly this situation, and the training held because the species had been practicing for 10,000 years. On arm 3, at 347, Jorith took a direct hit to her left arm that shattered the bone above the elbow. Thessari bones were dense but brittle under torsional stress, and the pulse round had hit at exactly the wrong angle. She dropped to 1 knee, her amber eyes going wide with pain, the cranial ridges flaring a deep violet that meant agony at the species level. The color was involuntary, broadcast, impossible to suppress. Every Thessari in the station felt it like a sympathetic pulse. Ossian stepped in front of her without a word. He stood in the center of the corridor and took everything they sent. His body was not invulnerable after 40 minutes. The layered dermis was bruised to the point where his surface skin had turned from mottled green to deep purple-black, and the impact tremors were rattling his teeth. But he did not move. He stood there like the decorative boulder Jorith had once called him, and the Keth Volar fire that should have finished her hit him instead, and he absorbed it, and he stayed. Behind him, Jorith splinted her own arm with a piece of corridor paneling, bit down on the pain hard enough that one of her secondary fangs cracked, and went back to shooting left-handed. Her accuracy dropped from perfect to merely devastating. On Arm 5 at 4:02, D. Hunvor's carapace cracked. It was the 12th engagement, and the Keth Volar had brought something heavier, a focused beam cutting tool meant for hull breaches, repurposed as a weapon. It hit D. Hunvor's right thoracic plate and split it along the stress line between the growth segments. The pain was extraordinary. Gorathi carapace was living tissue, laced with nerve endings that monitored structural integrity, the way a human monitored pain in bone, and cracking it was the equivalent of snapping a rib clean through. D. Hunvor staggered. His firing arm dropped. The corridor was suddenly open, the wall was gone, and the next Keth Volar cluster was 7 meters away and closing. Pale did something that no Vresi in the history of cross-species interaction had ever done to a Gorathi. She climbed him. Her small, translucent body scrambled up his back, her grip pads finding purchase on the edges of his armor plates, and she pressed herself flat across the cracked section. The Vresi hardening reflects the same biochemical response that let her species survive pressure changes in deep ocean environments engaged, and her body went rigid, sealing the crack like a living bandage. The pressure stabilized. The pain did not disappear, but the grinding sensation of plates shifting against each other stopped, and D. Hunvor could breathe again. It would not hold forever. It did not need to. "Fire," she said, from her position plastered across his back. D. Hunvor fired. On Arm 2, Thessic's sonic organs were beginning to swell. The Morvathi sonic burst was a biological weapon, not a mechanical one, and like any biological system, it had limits. Each burst inflamed the tissue, and after 14 bursts in 90 minutes, the organs were hot and tight, and beginning to ache in a way that told her she had maybe 6 more before they failed entirely. She used the 15th burst to clear a push of 8 Keth Volar, who had gotten within 4 meters of Vasho's position. The Dren had not moved her feet once in 90 minutes. Her four-legged stance was rooted to the deck, as if she had grown there, and the pile of fallen Keth Volar in front of her was growing like a barricade of its own. "How many more can you do?" Vasho asked. 5, Thessic said, "perhaps 6. Save them. I will hold the gap between." Thessic looked at the Dren, this creature she had dismissed in week 1 as slow, unimaginative, a species that compensated for a lack of brilliance with an excess of stubbornness. Vasho had not moved her feet. She had not flinched. She had not done anything except stand exactly where she was and fire exactly when it mattered and refuse, with the absolute conviction of a species that had evolved on a high-gravity world where falling down meant death, to give 1 centimeter of ground. "I will save them," Thessic said. By 500, the Keth Volar had taken Arm 4 and Arm 6. The cadets and security officers assigned to those positions had fallen back to the hub as planned, joining the central defense ring. Iniri, the Sulak, had sealed 2 hull breaches on the outer ring, one on Arm 4, where the atmosphere had vented so fast that the frost formed on the corridor walls before the compound hardened, and one on the junction between Arms 5 and 6, where a cutting charge had punched through a support strut and opened a gap the size of a fist. She sealed it in 7 seconds. Her forearms were pale now, the calcium reserves depleting, and the medical officer had brought her a protein pack that she consumed in 2 bites without stopping work. 9 defenders remained on the active line, against an estimated 180 remaining Kethvoller. But the Kethvoller had expected to take the station in 20 minutes. They had expected 30 soft targets, a quick strip, and a departure before anyone noticed. Instead, they had been bled in every corridor, stalled at every junction, and forced to spend ammunition and bodies on a station that fought back from every angle with a coordination that made no tactical sense. 12 species should not have been able to coordinate. Their doctrines were incompatible, their communication systems were different wavelengths, their instincts were pulling in 12 different directions. But they were coordinating, and the Kethvoller's own rigid cluster doctrine, 4-unit cells that did not adapt to novel formations, was breaking against defenders who fought in pairs and trios that did not match any known model. Cale pulled everyone back to the hub at 5:15. He was bleeding from 4 places. His left arm was functional but weak, and the cracked ribs made deep breathing feel like someone was pressing a blade between his lungs. He had been fighting alone for over 2 hours, and the solitude should have been crushing, but it was not. He had heard them on the comms the entire time: Jorith's sharp target calls, D. Hunvor's subsonic acknowledgments, Pale's clicking spectral reports, Ossian's rare and devastating single-word confirmations, Thesic's periodic warnings that she was down to 4 bursts, 3, 2. He had been alone in his corridor and part of something at the same time. The hub was defensible. 1 entrance per arm, 6 total, each one a blast door that could be sealed and reinforced. Cale sealed 4 of them: Arm 4, Arm 6, already fallen, and Arms 2 and 5, pulling those teams back through. He left Arm 1 and Arm 3 open, the last corridors where the fighting was still active, and called the final fallback. "They are regrouping," Pale reported from Arm 5, where she was still sealed to D. Hunvor's back like a translucent growth. Her voice was exhausted, the clicking cadence slower than it had been 3 hours ago, but steady. "Large formation. They are massing for a push." "Same here," Jorith confirmed from Arm 3. "At least 40 in the corridor. They are done being cautious." Cale looked at the remaining defenders in the hub. 9 cadets, 3 security officers, 1 injured proctor, 13 people. The medical staff were in the sealed infirmary 2 levels down, tending to the 2 cadets who had been pulled off the line with injuries too severe to fight through. "Fall back to the hub," Cale said, "both teams. We hold here." They came through the open blast doors in pairs, Jorith half carrying Ossian, whose legs had finally started to give under the accumulated punishment, the purple-black bruising visible even through his uniform. D. Hunvor with Pale still clinging to his back, her hardened body still sealing his cracked carapace, the 2 of them moving as a single asymmetric creature that had not existed 4 hours ago. Thesic and Vasho side by side, the Morvatha's swollen sonic organs visible as lumps beneath her jaw, the Dren still steady on her 4 feet. The remaining cadets battered and burned and running on the kind of fuel that only comes from having decided together that running is not what they do. Cale sealed the last 2 blast doors. The hub was a circle, roughly 40 meters across, with the tactical display at the center and the 6 sealed corridors radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel. The blast doors would hold for a while, not forever. "How long until the fleet?" he asked Veshan. 4 hours, if they received the signal and departed immediately. We have no confirmation." 4 hours. The blast doors might hold 2 if the Kethvoller did not bring cutting charges. If they did, maybe 40 minutes. Cale looked around the hub. Every cadet was wounded. Every one of them was still standing, or sitting, or in Ossian's case leaning against a console with the careful stillness of someone who knew that if he sat down he might not get up again. But they were all there. 12 species, 11, with Kales who 4 hours ago could not agree on how to walk through a doorway. "We hold," he said. Nobody argued, nobody questioned, nobody filed a formal complaint. The Kethvoller brought cutting charges. The first blast door arm one, Kale's corridor started to glow orange along the seam at 5:40. The cutting was slower than hull breach charges, more controlled, designed to open a door without collapsing the frame. It gave them time, but the time had a visible countdown, the orange line creeping along the door's edge, centimeter by centimeter, the heat building until the air in the hub near arm one shimmered. "Joreth," Kale said, "when that door opens, how many can come through the frame at once?" "2 maximum. The frame is standard compact gauge. And your reaction time at this range?" "I will not miss," she said. It was not bravado. Thessari did not do bravado. It was a statement of biomechanical fact delivered with the same emotional weight as announcing the temperature. "D Hunvor behind Joreth, second layer, anything she misses you catch." "The Thessari does not miss," D Hunvor said, and the way he said it with a gruff, grudging certainty was the most Gorathi way to express respect that Kale had ever heard. Pale eyes on all 6 doors. Spectrum sweep every 30 seconds. If they start cutting another door, I need to know before the heat shows. "Already watching," Pale said. She had detached from D Hunvor's back now. The Goratha's cracked carapace had been temporarily patched with a strip of Iniri's hardite compound, and was perched on top of a console, her small body elevated for maximum sensory range, her 6 eyes cycling through spectra in a pattern that looked like a lighthouse beam sweeping the dark. "Thessic, save your last burst. When I call for it, give me everything you have left aimed at the arm one doorway. 1 shot, make it count." Thessic touched her swollen jaw. "1 shot," she confirmed. The first door fell at 5:58. It did not explode inward. The cutting charges severed the locking mechanism and the hinges simultaneously, and the door toppled forward like a felled tree, slamming into the hub floor with a sound that rang through the entire station. Behind it, the corridor was packed with Kethvoller shoulder to shoulder, weapons up, the amber glow of their eyes filling the doorway like a wall of light. Joreth fired. She fired faster than any other cadet in the room could track. Her shots were not aimed in real time, they were pre-calculated, placed at the intercept points, where the first 2 Kethvoller would be when the rounds reached the doorway. The first 2 went down. The next 2 stepped over them and Joreth dropped them too. Behind her, D Hunvor's heavier weapon barked twice, catching a third-row attacker who had tried to angle past the doorframe. The doorway became a wall of fallen bodies. The Kethvoller pushed their own dead forward, using them as cover, and the fighting compressed into a brutal, close-range exchange at the mouth of a single corridor that was exactly wide enough for 2 bodies, and exactly deep enough for the defenders to stack fire in layers. Kale moved to Arm 4 when Pale called the second breach at 6:04. He arrived as the door started to glow, and he set up behind a flipped console with one of the security officers, a veteran Thessari named Creve who had not said a word all night but fought with the mechanical precision of someone who had done this before and expected to do it again. The second door fell at 6:12. Kale and Creve held it. Then Pale called a third breach on Arm 6 at 6:18, and Kale sent Thessic and Vasho to hold that door with the Dren cadet anchoring the position and the Morvathi ready with her remaining sonic burst. 3 breaches, 3 doorways. The hub became a circle of fire, the defenders rotating between positions, covering each other, calling targets across species lines without hesitation, without translation delay, without the careful diplomatic phrasing that had characterized every interaction at Corvith for 3 weeks. The language of combat was simpler than the language of coexistence. It was left to 6 meters. It was reloading cover. It was down medic keep firing. Iniri sealed the Arm 6 breach after Thessic drove the Kethvoller back with her last sonic burst the 16th. the one that had cost her everything the organs could give. The burst hit the corridor like a hammer strike, and the 6 Kethvoller in the doorway staggered backward, their chitinous plates rattling, their formation broken. Inuri pressed her forearms against the ruined doorframe and let the compound flow, a thick, gray-white substance that hardened in seconds to a tensile strength that exceeded the original door's rating. It was not elegant. It looked like someone had vomited concrete into a doorway. But it held, and Arm 6 was sealed, and that was one fewer front. Thesic collapsed against the wall, her sonic organs spent and swelling, her hands shaking. Vasho stood beside her and did not move, and when the Morvatha's legs gave out, the Dren shifted one of her 4 feet to brace the other cadet's weight without comment. By 6:30, the Kethvoller had committed everything to Arms 1 and 4. The other breaches had been sealed or stalemated. The fighting at the 2 open doorways was continuous, relentless, and very close. Kale's pulse rifle overheated twice, and the second time it refused to reset, the thermal regulator clicking uselessly, so he dropped it and picked up a fallen Kethvoller weapon heavier, uglier, with a trigger mechanism designed for fingers that bent the wrong way. He turned it over once, felt the balance point, found the trigger by touch and fired. It took him 4 seconds. The human adaptation speed was, as Pale would later note in her official after-action report, the single most unsettling thing she had observed in her entire academy career. Not the fighting, not the endurance, the speed at which the human picked up an alien weapon he had never held, figured out its mechanism by touch in the middle of a firefight, and began using it with lethal accuracy within the span of a single breath. Vresi had a cultural concept for creatures that could do this. The translation was approximate, but the closest rendering in compact standard was, the animal that eats everything. At 6:41, the Kethvoller commander made a mistake. Kale saw it on the tactical display, the 2 assault groups at Arms 1 and 4 pulling back simultaneously. Not retreating, repositioning. They were going to mass both groups on a single arm and push with everything they had left. They are consolidating on Arm 1, Pale confirmed from her console perch. All remaining forces, over 100 signatures. Kale looked at the Arm 1 doorway. The pile of fallen Kethvoller was already waist-high. The corridor beyond was scorched and cratered, and now 100 more were coming. Everyone to Arm 1, Kale said. Everything we have, 1 door. They came, all of them. Jorith with her shattered arm splinted and firing left-handed. Ossian barely upright but on his feet, his surface skin almost black with bruising, planting himself beside the doorframe with the immovable certainty of a species that did not know how to fall. Dhunvor filling the right side of the defense line, his cracked carapace patched and his 4 arms holding steady. Pale on his shoulder now, calling distances. Thesic propped against a console, unable to fight but calling observations with her voice since her organs had nothing left. Vasho on all 4 feet beside Thesic, covering the angle. Inuri with compound building in her forearms for a final seal if it came to that. The 3 security officers. Proctor Veshin, who had picked up a weapon at some point during the night, and was firing with the cold precision of someone who had once been a soldier before she became a teacher. 13 defenders at 1 doorway, 100 Kethvoller in the corridor. The final push came at 6:47. It was not elegant. It was not tactical. It was a wave of bodies forcing through a doorway that could only admit 2 at a time, and every species in that hub put everything they had into holding it. Jorith fired until her weapon overheated, and then used the hot barrel as a bludgeon against a Kethvoller that made it through the frame. Dhunvor stepped into the doorway itself, filling the frame with his armored body, and let them crash against him like water against stone. Ossian braced himself against the doorframe beside Dhunvor and became a second wall, and the 2 of them, Gorathi and Kelthari, species that had never fought alongside each other in recorded history, held the line shoulder to shoulder. And Kale Maddox stood behind them and did the thing that humans do. He did not panic. He did not freeze. He did not calculate the odds and decide they were unacceptable. He did the next thing, and then the next thing, and then the next thing, with the steady, grinding, relentless persistence of a species that had survived ice ages and plagues and world wars and the death of its own son's patience, not by being the strongest or the fastest or the most armored, but by being the one that did not stop. The Keth Voller broke at 7:03. Not all at once. Not with a dramatic retreat or a surrender signal. They simply stopped pushing. The pressure at the doorway eased, then ceased. The fire from the corridor slowed, then stopped. And then, on the tactical display, Cale watched the 7 shapes begin to pull back from the station, one by one, accelerating toward the perimeter with the urgent energy of a force that had miscalculated and was cutting its losses before the calculation got worse. They had expected 30 soft targets. They had found 13 hard ones, and the hallways had eaten them. The hub was quiet. Cale stood at the arm one doorway and looked at the corridor beyond the scorch marks, the cracked paneling, the fallen Keth Voller stacked 3 deep in places. The air was thick with the chemical smell of spent pulse charges and the sharper tang of ruptured chitinous armor, a smell that would live in his uniform for weeks. His hands were shaking. He noticed this with a clinical detachment that he knew was shock beginning to set in, and he clamped his hands against his thighs and breathed through the cracked ribs until the shaking slowed. The quiet itself was disorienting. For 4 hours the station had been a continuous wall of sound, the concussive thud of breech charges, the whine and crack of pulse fire, the deep bone vibration of Thesic sonic bursts, the grinding of Keth Voller boots on deck plating, the sharp reports of chitinous armor shattering under close-range fire. Now there was nothing. The ventilation system hummed. A console beeped softly, running its diagnostic cycle as if nothing had happened. Somewhere deep in the station's structure, a support strut that had been weakened by cutting charges groaned and settled, and every defender in the hub flinched at the sound, hands reaching for weapons that were already in them. Behind him, someone was being treated by the medical staff who had emerged from the sealed infirmary. The head medic, a Thesari with hands that moved with the same preternatural speed as Jorith's, but applied to sutures instead of trigger pulls, was working on Ossian's bruised dermis, pressing diagnostic pads against the purple-black skin with an expression of professional fascination that suggested she had never seen a Kelthari absorb this much punishment and remain conscious. Someone else was sitting on the floor with their back against a console, breathing in the careful, measured way of someone who was holding themselves together by will alone. The tactical display was still active, showing the 7 Keth Voller shapes receding into the darkness between stars, their formation loose now, ragged, the staggered V broken into a scattered retreat that told Cale everything he needed to know about the state of their commander's confidence. Proctor Veshin stood at the central console. Her silver-blue skin was darker than it had been 4 hours ago, flushed with the exhaustion pigment that Thesari physiology produced under extreme stress. One of her 4 arms hung at an angle that suggested damage she had not mentioned. She looked at Cale. "The fleet has confirmed receipt of the distress signal," she said. "Estimated arrival in 2 hours and 14 minutes. Cale nodded. "Cadet Maddox." Her voice was formal, but the secondary harmonics were back, the emotional undercurrent that she had stripped away in those first minutes when she was afraid. The harmonics now carried something that Cale could not fully translate, but the closest human approximation was the sound of someone acknowledging a debt they did not know how to repay. "I will be writing a report. I imagine you will. It will note that 11 cadets from 12 species, in their 3rd week of a joint integration program that had, by every metric, failed, held a station against a full Keth Voller raiding force for 4 hours and 16 minutes with training equipment and no authorized tactical plan. Sounds about right. It will also note," she continued, "that the human cadet assigned himself the most dangerous position alone, held it for over 2 hours against the primary assault element, and then organized the final defense with a tactical improvisation that no integration curriculum in the compact has ever produced or anticipated. You can leave that part out if you want. I will not leave it out. The report will not be believed. Probably not. Veshin's mandibles clicked once, and for the first time in 3 weeks, Kale recognized the sound. It was not fury, not fear, not controlled formality. It was the Thessari equivalent of a laugh. I will write it anyway, she said. Kale turned and looked at the cadets. They were scattered across the hub in the loose, exhausted sprawl of people who had nothing left to prove. Jorith was sitting next to Ashen, her shattered arm resting across his broad shoulders because his body was the most stable surface in the room, and she was too tired to hold the splint up. Ashen had not moved away. His secondary eyelids were half closed, the Kelthari expression that could mean exhaustion or contentment or both, and his body was still angled slightly forward, still braced, as if some part of him had not yet received the message that the fighting was over. Dihunvor was on the floor with his back against a console, his cracked carapace patched with hardite compound that was already beginning to yellow as it cured. Pale sat beside him, not on him, not sealed to his back, but next to him, her small, translucent body barely reaching his lowest arm joint. She was watching the tactical display with her 6 eyes in their slow, cycling sweep, and Dihunvor had not asked her to stop, and she had not offered to, and the two of them sat there in a configuration that would have been absurd 12 hours ago, and was now simply what they were. Thessic was lying on her back with a cold pack pressed to her swollen jaw, and Vasha was standing over her on all 4 feet, not because the Morvathi needed guarding, but because the Dren had not yet found a reason to move, and until she did, she would stay. Iniri was examining her forearms, where the hardite compound had depleted to the point where her skin was translucent and thin, and the Kelthari medic was quietly applying nutrient gel without being asked, without being thanked, without any of the formal cross-species courtesy protocols that Corvith's integration program had spent 3 weeks trying to teach. They did not need the protocols anymore. They had found something underneath them. 12 species, 1 squad. The math had not changed, their doctrines were still incompatible, their communication systems still imperfect, their evolutionary instincts still pulling in 12 different directions. But something else had changed, something that doctrine could not account for and instinct could not override. They had bled in the same hallway. They had held the same door. They had called targets for each other in the dark and covered each other's wounds, and refused to leave when leaving was the rational, authorized, species-appropriate response. And now they sat in the aftermath and looked at each other, and the looking was different. Kale sat down on the floor with his back against the arm one doorframe. The metal was still warm from the cutting charges. His ribs ached. His shoulder throbbed. His hands had stopped shaking. On the tactical display, the last Keth Volar shape winked out of sensor range. In 2 hours, the fleet would arrive. There would be debriefings and medical evaluations, and a great deal of very complicated paperwork. The Compact Joint Integration Directorate would send a review board. The review board would interview every cadet, and every cadet would tell a different version of the same story, because 12 species remember events through 12 different sensory filters, and the board would spend weeks trying to reconcile them all into a single coherent narrative and eventually give up. Proctor Veshin would write her report, and Kale suspected she was right, it would not be believed. 11 cadets from a failed integration program, holding a station for 4 hours against a force 30 times. Their size did not fit any model in the Compact's tactical library. But the Compact's tactical library had never had a model for what happened when 12 species stopped being 12 species and started being 1 squad. There was no doctrine for it, no precedent, no entry in any training manual that said, in extremis, differences of biology, culture, and evolutionary history may become irrelevant, provided the hallway is narrow enough and the cost is shared. Cale closed his eyes. Around him, 11 cadets from 11 species breathed the same recycled air, nursed the same wounds, and waited for the same dawn. By the time it came, none of them remembered why they had ever sat at separate tables.